Welcome back here on Live Now from Fox, and I do want to get you right back into the headlines here as we have the latest on the case against Luigi Mangione, the man accused of assassinating the CEO of United Healthcare. Mangione will be allowed to wear regular clothes for his next court appearances in New York as his pretrial hearings get underway starting Monday. The court has ordered that Mangione will be allowed 2 suits, 3 shirts, 3 sweaters, 3 pairs of pants, 5 pairs of socks, and 1 pair of shoes there that do not have any laces. He can also wear quote-unquote civilian clothes as he's transported. So what does all this mean and what's next in the case? I do want to bring in Neama Rahmani, former federal prosecutor and president of West Coast Trial Lawyers. Thank you so much, Neama, as always, for being here with us today.
Of course, Josh. Thanks for having me as always.
Of course. And first off, I do want to ask you, before we get into the pretrial hearings and all of that, the civilian clothes, what does that mean? How significant is it for that ruling to happen and for Mangione to be able to wear essentially regular clothes?
Josh, it's a big deal, but it's not unexpected. That orange prison jumpsuit is pretty prejudicial. So jurors tend to think that someone is guilty. And it doesn't matter whether you're Sean Diddy Combs or Luigi Mangione. Defense attorneys like it when their clients wear civilian clothes. And they tend to wear those neutral colors, right? The sweater vest. They want their client to seem like an ordinary Joe, even though they might be accused of one of the most heinous murders that certainly we've seen in recent memory.
And as far as the shoes, I noticed that it said shoes without laces. I have to imagine that that's pretty standard as well.
It is, and we know that shoelaces can be used to commit suicide, and they're a potential problem. That's why, for safety reasons, usually these criminal defendants, they're not allowed to have laces, whether they're in a courtroom or in federal prison.
Can you explain these pretrial hearings? Because those are set to begin on Monday. What does that consist of? How long can they last? And do we get any potential new information?
What we're going to see are motions to suppress evidence and to try to strike the death penalty. Let's not forget, if you're a death penalty qualified lawyer, it doesn't matter if you're representing Luigi Mangione or Brian Koberger or Nicholas Cruz. Your really sole job is to keep your client alive. So on the motion to suppress, we're going to see the defense try to exclude the evidence that was found in Mangione's backpack when he was arrested in Pennsylvania. Obviously, you have the 3D ghost gun. You have the manifesto. That's very damaging evidence that puts him at the scene of the crime and as the shooter, and obviously gives some sort of motive. Now, that motion is unlikely to succeed because if the arrest was lawful, and it was, we obviously saw the video of Mangione killing the CEO in Midtown Manhattan in broad daylight, and there was a nationwide manhunt for him. If the arrest was lawful, that means there was probable cause, then a search incident to arrest, which includes one's backpack or anything they can reach, or an inventory search, is also lawful under the Fourth Amendment. So I expect that motion to be denied. But Josh, the reason the defense raises these motions, sometimes it's a Hail Mary, but they like to create arguments on appeal, because when you're talking about the death penalty, it's actually more likely that a death sentence gets overturned on appeal than a death penalty qualified jury actually returning a not guilty verdict. The second set of motions we'll see is to strike the death penalty. And the arguments that we're seeing from the defense is that Pam Bondi's pretrial publicity that tainted the jury pool, and that the DOJ didn't follow their own internal protocols. There's a capital case review committee that typically handles these cases. And the third argument is that because we have parallel state and federal prosecutions, that violates double jeopardy. But those arguments, again, have been considered by other courts. They're recycled, they've been rejected. So I don't expect them to win either.
When you talk about publicity, there's no question over the last year since all of this unfolded, there's been a lot of attention. You've had people showing up at the hearings who don't know Luigi Mangione or the victim there, the United Healthcare CEO. What sort of role does that publicity play in the legal process and how it plays out?
Well, this is a fascinating case. I have never seen an accused murderer with this much support. I just haven't seen it. It never happens. Obviously, look, some of it is the nature of the victim. I know folks are frustrated with our health insurance system, healthcare system in general in the United States. Obviously, by all accounts, this is someone who's educated, wealthy. Frankly, he's good looking. So I'm not surprised he has the support, but that raises the specter and the risk if you're the prosecution of jury nullification. That means one or two jurors, even if they think he's guilty, they choose to acquit him, and that could potentially hang the panel. I think in a case like this with a criminal defendant that has this type of popularity, that's a risk that you have to consider. Now, general publicity, I think, with social media and traditional media, it wasn't like it was 30, 40 years ago where there was just a couple news stations, right? I mean, everyone has seen this video. Their video surveillance is so prevalent. We've seen so many social media videos, whether it's the George Floyd case or a case like this. So I don't think there's anyone in the country that doesn't know who Luigi Mangione is and who hasn't seen this case. So I think pretrial publicity means a lot less because typically when you analyze these cases, the question you ask is, can you get a fair and impartial jury? And I don't think by moving this case out of New York City or even New York State, you're going to find folks that haven't seen this video and don't have a preconceived notion about what happened.
And from there, the question does become based on your expertise and that fact, talking about a jury pool, does that eventually lead to this going to trial or a potential plea deal ahead of time? Or is that something that you can't gauge as it is maybe based on each individual case?
There will be a trial in this case unless the Department of Justice takes the death penalty off the table. Again, if you're handling this case, and again, going back to Brian Koberger, right? One of the most gruesome murders that we've all seen for University of Idaho college students. That case, after years of litigation, ended up in a plea deal, a life without the possibility of parole. The death penalty changes the calculus because when the death penalty is on the table and prosecutors are seeking that death sentence, there's no deal to be made. The defense may as well roll the dice because, again, you got to get 12 out of 12 jurors. And even if they lose at the guilt phase, maybe there's some evidence of mitigation. It is hard to find 12 jurors who are going to unanimously agree on anything, much less putting someone to death. So if there's a life without the possibility of parole deal, I can see a deal happening, but certainly not one if the federal government decides to move forward with the death penalty case. Of course, knowing that there is no possibility of the death penalty in the New York State case.
One thing that's interesting is there was a lot of confusion. We had you on here to help break it down with the federal charges that were dropped there. Can you explain to folks out there which federal charges do remain and how that whole process works? Because a lot of folks out there did say they thought there was no more federal case against him.
There is still a federal case. What was dropped was the terrorism charges. So if you're looking at terrorism, terrorism requires either an intent to intimidate the public or influence the government. And a lot of folks thought that because Luigi Mangione had this manifesto, seemed to have some, thoughts, really negative thoughts about the health insurance industry, and he targeted this individual on that basis, that this was a domestic terrorism case. The issue that the judge had is, well, Luigi Mangione never disseminated his manifesto to anyone. He never really talked about it. So the judge said, even though he had these beliefs, he didn't have that intent to influence or intimidate. It's still going to move forward as a murder case, but it's not going to have that terrorism component for that reason.
And one thing that's also interesting is you're talking about a federal case where cameras are never allowed inside the courtroom. New York doesn't allow cameras inside either. I wanted to get your take as far as what maybe some of the benefits would be to have cameras in court and allow folks in the public to watch this play out, but also what some of the drawbacks might be.
Josh, I am a big believer in cameras in the courtroom and transparency. Our trials are open to the public, and it shouldn't be a situation where people have to line up the night before or rely on courtroom sketch artists. Now, this is one of those areas where each state, each court is different. Obviously, in our federal system, under the rules of criminal procedure, there are no cameras allowed in any federal courtroom or any recording for that matter. So reporters that want to cover the case, they have to either be in the courtroom or be in an overflow courtroom in the courthouse to watch what's happening. New York also does not allow cameras in the courtroom, but there's going to be certain other high profile cases, like for instance, Charlie Kirk. That case, there may be cameras because under state law there in Utah, cameras can be allowed. Obviously, I'm sitting here in California. We regularly see cameras in California courtrooms. So each state is unique, but I believe in transparency. I believe people should have access. I think it helps dispel some conspiracy theories. So hopefully the law changes and we do see more cameras in courtrooms so people that want to follow the trial can.
All right. And kind of going back to what we were talking about here, my last question for you, the pretrial hearings, what do we need to be watching for to come out of that, again, beginning on Monday?
What we want to look for are significant rulings on the evidence and the death penalty. Assuming those motions are denied, we're going to move forward with trial. And I don't know what kind of defense they're going to put up here because it's going to be tough to defend this case on the merits, right? We've all seen the video. He rented that e-bike. Apparently there was his DNA, fingerprints at the scene. He did print this ghost gun. Again, there seems to be a lot of evidence indicating that Mangione was the shooter. Now, again, that's just the guilt phase. There is always the penalty phase, right? And at that phase, you'll see evidence of mitigation. We don't know a whole lot about him. Apparently, he suffered some sort of surgery, and it really changed the way he viewed things. Certainly not an excuse for murder. But when you're talking about the death penalty, jurors have to weigh the aggravating factors versus the mitigating factors. So expect the defense to make a strong mitigation case. But again, the evidence gets suppressed or the death penalty gets struck, that's going to be a very, very different calculus for the defense there. I think they'll be arguing and negotiating from a position of strength rather than the position they're in now.
All right. Neama Rahmani, as always, thank you so much for being here. Anything we missed? Anything you want to add before I let you go?
I think one important thing, and we talked about these parallel prosecutions, state and federal, it's not something that you typically see. We've seen them recently in the George Floyd case or the Ahmaud Arbery case in Georgia. But typically, the feds, they don't pile on after state prosecutors charge the case. I mean, we talked about Charlie Kirk, for instance, right? Tyler Robinson, there's no federal prosecution. Brian Koberger, no federal prosecution. Obviously, the difference in those cases is those states had the death penalty. But that's why some of the Mangione fans do believe that he's being treated unfairly and railroaded because, again, you don't typically see a subsequent federal prosecution unless there is a compelling federal interest like civil rights, which we don't typically see. So it'll be interesting to see what happens there.
All right, Neama, thank you again for being here and helping to break it all down. We definitely appreciate it, and I'm sure we'll have you back in a week or so to help break down what happens during those hearings. Thank you again.
Thanks, Josh. Talk soon.